Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Marshall Reed Sanders with you again. I would like to thank you for continuing to watch and to learn in this series concerning the white matrix and also in this part of the series, which is reparations. Now, I know that many of you, despite all of the information that I've given you, want to know why I continue with this series. Well, let me give you an example of how persuasive the white matrix is. Now, as you've heard in my many videos, that the white matrix must be destroyed. It really must be destroyed. And that there is no logic, truth, integrity, or anything else in the white matrix. Well, I've had a question concerning that integrity to someone who submitted to me why I continue with this series. Let me ask you some questions, if I may. Are you aware of how many holidays, if you will, are celebrated in America alone on Confederate leaders and Confederate pride? Now understand, I'm sure to the individual members who are in the white matrix who celebrate this, they've deceived themselves and allowed themselves to be deceived to think that it has anything whatsoever to do with family pride or pride in their regions. The simple fact is, after about 1890 to roughly even to now, most of the statues and memorials they put up was in response to blacks seeking independence and had absolutely nothing with family pride or anything else that you could find excusable. But I digress. How many holidays would you say are celebrated just concerning them? Did you know that there are 11 holidays celebrating these leaders? Some of these holidays, like Jefferson Davidson Day and also General Robert Lee Day, as well as Confederate Heroes Day and Confederate Memorial Day, are replicated more than once in celebration. What I'm about to say to you, I ask that you say to yourself, and ask yourself this. When a person of color is talking about reparations, you want to know what the most common answer to them is? Well, as a person of color, I can tell you exactly what the first answer is, and the most prominent answer is. That was so long ago. Why do you keep talking about things like this? Think about that. Now, they like to celebrate and bring up that same generation and those people. Matter of fact, they make it a yearly holiday, so it's almost a requirement to remember these people and those times. Along with doing so, many of them even dress up as those historical people to remind people to never forget them in their time. But when people of color remind them of all the details of that time, they say, why do you remember and keep talking about that time? Do you understand how demonically, completely, 100% away from reality, that is. Just a question to you. Now, I'm going to continue on the reparations aspect of this. The U.S. government, for those who are not aware, is a corporation. I'm sorry you didn't know that. The United States ceased to be a government after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Are you aware of that? The government in which we call the U.S. government was from the Act of 1871, February of 1871, in which they gave the District of Columbia Corporation the ability to act as a, a government. This, of course, was instituted by international bankers who have been trying to get into the U.S. for a very long time. Some of the what you call founding fathers wrote exclusively about not allowing international banks into the coffers of the U.S. government. And yet, after Civil War, rather, the U.S. used that as an excuse to bring in the international bankers, since they were conspirators meant to do that in the government from the very beginning. Mainly those who were in charge of the slave trade. Are you starting to put it together now? So the slave traders, and those, of course, who were their puppet masters, made a tremendous fortune off the 100% free labor of black slaves, who then used the finances to bail out the real U.S. government, or rather, to pay off their debt and then take their place as the new government. Here's the only good part for this series, however. That makes the U.S. not a government that you cannot sue, but rather a corporation. And if under maritime law, if you're not familiar with that, that allows legal jurisdictions for a corporation to operate in other countries. It is a military type of law. And every U.S. court, and every federal court, and every Congress, and every government institution in America is a maritime, military, corporate entity. And we all know that a corporation, or at least I hope we all know, can be sued. Therefore, as part of this reparations payment, we are to sue the U.S. corporation as well as its umbrella business corporations around the world. Now, the amount of money that I had recommended before, roughly of, I believe it was around 9 trillion. I believe it was not significantly less than that in its overall effect. However, 9 trillion would certainly be more than enough to where economic freedom can be grasped by all of the American people, and first directly to the black slaves, and then directly to all other American citizens. However, substantially less money is needed to put the corporations into a lawsuit. Because Here's what happens in a lawsuit, and this is why it has to be done by law. You see, despite the fact that the federal judges and every other judge is corrupt and are puppets put into place by those same corporate entities, when you have a lawsuit, you have something called scope. For those of you who are not aware of it, is when you file a lawsuit, your accusation can be backed up or removed by just a suggestion. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? But let me give you an example. Let's say you have a lawsuit against Google, or I'll give you a better example. Colin Kaepernick had a lawsuit against the San Francisco 49ers. But his attorneys were very wise. They said, let's sue the entire NFL and the 32 teams. Why the 32 teams? Because all 32 teams are part of one whole, though they appear to be opponents one of another. See, they're all corporations, and yet those corporations have become one as a monopoly. So Colin Kaepernick actually went out and he sued every team in the NFL, which gave him the scope to prove it, which meant that the NFL had to turn over all of their internal emails, correspondence one with another. Comes to find out that they had colluded to keep Colin Kaepernick out of the league. Subsequently, there was a undisclosed resolution to this where he received finances that we're not made privy to. Now, you have to understand, this is the only real way for people to first acquire the information through the scope. And in this scope, you will find documentations that must be turned over to the courts to show the conclusion and the collusion of these corporations to extract free labor, to put people of color in prison and jail for the cause of free labor and profit, and to keep black economically not viable. And so the collective means of what slavery produced was again well over $200 trillion. And the collective means to what these corporations do today is well over $200 trillion. So to say on a high end of $9 trillion that these corporations owe, well, good thing we're not asking for what we really deserve. But again, I digress. What I would like to speak with is the cause of concentration camps. Now, many of you say, what do you mean by concentration camps? There were no concentration camps in the U.S. Marshall, tell me about the concentration camps that you find to be in the U.S. Because, yes, we know about slavery, but no one were treated like the Jews. After all, if there's a Holocaust in this country, why would we not hear about a Holocaust in this country? Think. You see, words have power. A person can be accused of something like murder, or they can be accused of something like manslaughter. When someone thinks murder, they think of a violent person who plans, generally speaking, of course. When somebody thinks manslaughter, they think someone died, but it may have been an accident or some other thing. But the person is dead, and you can make someone think the way you want them to think by adding or subtracting or even excluding words. Now, if you said that black slavery was not black slavery, if you substituted with a Holocaust, if you substituted slavery with concentration camps, would that make you think differently? Of course it would. Because concentration camps are synonymous with the worst of human society, treating other human society at a pace that is certainly not human. And yet, that is exactly what black slavery was and remains to be today, a concentration camp. Don't believe me? Let me read the definition of a concentration camp and let's see if I'm incorrect or not. Concentration camp. Here are the definitions. A camp where persons are confined, usually without hearings and typically under harsh conditions, often as a result of their membership in a group the government has identified as suspect. Number two, a definition. A place or situation characterized by extremely harsh conditions. Number three, and this is more pointed, just as number one was more pointed. A camp where large numbers of people, such as political prisoners, prisoners of war, and refugees, are detained for the purpose of concentrating them in one place. Did you hear that? I'm going to read that third one again. A camp where large numbers of people or persons, such as political prisoners, prisoners of war, and refugees, are detained for the purpose of concentrating them in one place. Now, do you see? You see, a slave was technically not a slave, except under political means, as the 13th Amendment even defined it as. It says that slavery is not to be called slavery, nor indentured servant is allowed except for, or given the scope of saying, the only way you can make this legal is if the person has been convicted of a crime. What is a crime, ladies and gentlemen? It is something that a person from a government or a corporation institute through politics, because only through politics are laws formed. So these laws were formed to make prisoners out of blacks and therefore make them enslaved into that process. That makes this a legal issue. That makes this a lawsuit of political law proportions. That makes this a concentration camp, ladies and gentlemen. So slavery was not a bunch of random people deciding to put blacks in a certain location. It was a government instituted policy to put blacks as political prisoners for the institution of concentration camps. Kind of makes you think a little bit differently, doesn't it? Because one of the least understood things about concentration camps in Nazi Germany. Did you know that many of the Jews or Israelis or whatever you will, and as well as Poles and as well as Gypsies, were actually being forced to make bombs and pots and pans that can be carried out into the field of war and the trenches and such other material? Switch that around. What were blacks, slaves, told to make and to build? Well, sure, we know about the picking cotton and such other things, but you do know that there were also slavery places on making homes and such other things, right? And other materials, clothing, textiles, and such other things. So, what we're really literally talking about is a concentration camp formed through the policies, the government policies, as a prisoner of war by a government, and then subsequently after that by a corporation. Therefore, it opens up a valid claim for prisoners of war. Now, we know this defense was won and presented by the Japanese during World War II, where they were also not in internment camps in America. They were prisoners of war, and they were in concentration camps. But the words are powerful, so they tell us internment camps. Doesn't sound anything like concentration camps. Sounds soft and just helpful almost. And the white matrix people fall for it just as they fall for everything else. This is about righteousness, and this is about reparations. But you can't repair something that you don't know is torn. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to repair something that was torn. And to forbid people from even having the discussion of saying, hey, you love to talk about the garment that your grandmother made. And yet at the same time, you do not want me to speak about the garment that your grandmother tore it from in the first place so that she can make you yours. Interesting, isn't it? That everything in every part of black society and black positions and black claims to the things that we're owed always ends up as a, but that was so long ago. And you were never a slave. Interesting. But my response, if your grandmother died, if your granddad died, if your parent died, etc., 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 why should you get the insurance money? Why should you get the possessions? You never worked for that. And insurance money should have gone to the person who, okay, they died. So why should you get anything that belonged to your ancestors? See the illogical understanding of the white matrix? It excuses demonic, illogical thinking and accuses that same demonic, illogical thinking to those who are not illogical, but rather illogical and not demonic, simply angry and seeking justice. So, for this segment here, understand we want to remove the concentration camps of the U.S. Corporation of America. That is another reparation demand in America. And I do hope that many of you, I do hope that all of you support that demand. Because it's easy to walk past or even drive past a fenced in area with armed guards and a bunch of people that you can't see and continue on your day and have fun and make plans and such other things that people do every single day. But eventually, when those guards go outside that gate and they stop you and bring you inside of that gate, your reality is going to change. And being the one that suffers this time, you would say, how can anybody not stop and see what's going on and what happened to me? I'm outraged. Not just of those who imprisoned me, but by those who ignore me being imprisoned. You see, there's no reason to expect those people to side with me. After all, the person remembers, I didn't care for these people here either. But then it's too late. And so I'm asking you to join with me on this reparation hunt, if you will. Now's the time to gather with any person that you can and seek reparations. Seek to repair something that's been torn asunder. Seek to remove the prisoners that you ignore and stop trying to drown out their voices and rather amplify their voices and rush the gate if you have to and free your people. They're not your people because of their skin color. They're not your people because you particularly know them, or family members, or friends, or such other things of that nature. They're your people because they're supposed to be under the same protection of love and law that you are under. And they seek salvation from slavery, just like you would seek for yourself. Don't deny people the right to be free. Don't deny yourself the right to be free. And above all things, don't take victims. Tell them they are not victims. And then constantly bring up the great hero and worship due to those who victimized them. This is Marshall Sanders. It is Friday for those who are celebrators of the Shabbat or Sabbath or seventh day. Shabbat Shalom. To all those who are continuing in series and listening to my sometimes rambling, but good information. Thank you for continuing to follow this. I will soon bring out the finances and the class action lawsuit participants whom the people of color can sue, and how to pay for this. You're going to find to be astoundingly simple, and I will do that next week and then give you the overlay to how that can be implemented. But I digress again. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Have a wonderful weekend to everyone who's under the sound of my voice. Shalom.